panel members are Nina Sickenga, and she is the co-founder of MOS, Makers of Sustainable Spaces. Actually, they are located just behind this co-working space. Penny Sparke, she is a professor of design history at Kingston University. Koert van Mensvoort, and he is the co-founder of Next Nature. And the chair will be held by Peter Maxwell, and he is a frame editor. Guys, please step onto the stage. A warm applause for the panel. Do your thing.
Where you want to sit, Missy?
Hi guys, so thanks for coming. I just want to do a quick bit of housekeeping in terms of how panels are going to work over the course of the next 2 days. There are going to be 4 more panels alongside this one, and the way we've tried to construct these is that we are asking each panel member to provide 2 sets of images. The first image is kind of a status quo in relation to the topic at hand, so kind of where we're at now or how we've got to where we're at now, whether that's good or bad. The second set of images are not an idealized future or not a solution to the topic, but maybe kind of a trajectory, a preferred trajectory away from the present. So the way this is going to work is we're going to cycle through the first set of images, kind of compare and contrast and see what the discussion points are or what the differences are. And then we'll go into the next set of images, discuss those, and then at the end, hopefully, there will be some time for questions. So why talk about something seemingly or potentially as mundane as kind of the integration of nature into interior space today? Well, I think really, for me, the question is whether it is mundane. I know we all potentially have plants at home, in the workplace, in the hospitality space, but do we really think about them functionally in relation to spatial design? Do we place them at the core of how we think about spatial design in a really fundamental way? And should we be doing that? The question of how we bring natural materials, images of nature, or living, breathing nature into space is as long as the history of habitation. So it's not a new idea. Even this phrase, biophilic design, as Penny was telling me last night, has been around since the mid-70s. This idea of the science behind why we are, improved mentally, our mental health, our physical health by being in nature. It's not a new thing, but I think we can all agree that the kind of topic has come into the public imagination much more recently over the last 5 to 10 years. People are really kind of utilizing this phrase biophilic design in a more instrumental way. Why is that happening? Well, I think at Frame, as someone who publishes a lot of different types of spaces, the way we would analyze it is it's really coming from the office sector. This idea for developers and employers that in an age where careers are more fluid, the office is becoming something that they really need to use to attract and retain the best staff. And this idea of providing space that improves their wellness is really attractive to many people. Add into that, the science behind biophilic design, the idea that certain spaces can improve things like productivity, concentration, reduce the number of days people take off sick. From a capital investment point of view, it's quite easy to encourage people or developers to put down cash for those kind of things. But I think that mindset, we're obviously thinking about the relationship between plant and space in a more developed way, but I think even that mindset is somewhat impoverished, perhaps, especially at a time when our general global relationship with nature is somewhat fraught. There's a lot of anxiety, specifically within younger generations, around our stewardship of the earth and the natural environment. If you add into that the fact that increasingly over the next kind of 2 or 3 decades, the majority of the world population will live in urban centers that have, through densification, less provision for green space. On top of that, you add the fact that depending on which study you look at, we spend over 3/4 of our time inside anyway. There's kind of this strange dichotomy between, our desire to live in nature and to be better stewards of nature and the kind of time we actually spend around nature and kind of really integrated with nature, So this is something on which I'm not an expert, but thankfully we have 3 great experts who have 3 kind of varied perspectives on this topic that kind of look at maybe not what the answer to this question is, but maybe kind of define what the question should be about how we integrate nature more thoroughly into our kind of built environment. Nina is the founder of MOS, which stands for Makers of Sustainable Spaces. And that's a practice that really, I think, to our mind at Frame, is thinking in a far more developed and holistic way about how you kind of green the interior, and you think about nature and interior space as a system, as something that the people in that space have to be involved with in a really kind of lived way. Penny is a professor of the history of design, and she's been thinking about this topic since, I think, the mid-90s. There's a book coming out this year called Nature Inside, from Yale Press, which is really the culmination of all of this thinking. So I think that runs from the Victorian period up to the modern day, so it's really kind of providing that historical perspective. Then Koert, you are the founder or co-founder of Next Nature, and I guess for you it's really a question of thinking about how we relate to nature in the modern age, how technology relates to our, the biosphere, but also kind of human nature. So I think we'll provide a very interesting lens going forward in how we integrate these spaces with technology and how we make it a kind of more self-sustaining system. So we're going to start off by going through everyone's images. I don't know whose images are which, so
Yes, this is my one. Yeah.
Can we kick off with you?
Yes, I think that's a good. Yeah, I took this image. For me, this is like showing the regular office. From the past till now, you see like a few plants in pots standing, not really adding something to the space, and yeah, it's also like a small variation of type of plants, and this is really showing for me like the passive way of how plants are added into the interior, where we believe more that plants are green, not like separate plants, but ecosystems should be integrated in the interior. So this is like where it's now, and of course the image, which is not shown after this one but later, is for us like where it should go to.
So there's kind of very much an image of nature kind of segregated within the environment, just kind of not integrated but just kind of positioned. Penny, this must be your...
That's a bit of a giveaway, isn't it? Yes, I apologise for going back at a conference which is really about the future, but I think there are things we can learn, particularly from the Victorian period, where plants really came inside the home for the first time, really, in a serious way. And I think it's important to remember the kind of meanings those plants had at that time, because I think we've lost them a bit now. Maybe we should rethink about them in the contemporary context. I mean, those plants were there for I think three main purposes. One was for education. There was a strong sense that children were taught the names of plants and flowers in a way that we've lost now, and they were part of that sort of domestic education that went on. They were very much understood as being part of health, and that was both physical health, because they knew that they gave off oxygen, and they knew also that plants helped mental health. I don't think they didn't do the kind of experiments that we did much later, but they knew, for example, that they calmed you. They saw them as companions, and there are several books that write about them as being companions for invalids or the widower, however, so that's very important as well. And I think the most important thing about the Victorians' love of plants was that they had a shared sense of Christian faith, and they believed that nature was made by God, and obviously we've lost this for the most part now, and therefore nature was beautiful and true, and that was a sort of shared belief system that they had.
Koert, this must be your image.
Yes, this must be my flower wallpaper. And I think indeed people still believe nature is beautiful and true. That still exists, that notion. And then you have these beautiful yellow flowers. You see them in the field, and you also want to bring them in your home. So you end up with a wallpaper with a picture of these flowers, which I think it's not nature. It is an image of nature. And quite often, when we talk about nature, we talk about images of nature and how we like to position images of nature in an artificial space, like an interior, which is, I would say, by default, an artificial space. And then we want to bring in the nature. And often we only bring in the visual appeal. So you see a beautiful flower, it smells nice, but then you have a wallpaper of a flower and you don't smell anything, it's just the visual part. It's so limiting, and we need to move beyond that.
And so this is my contribution. I'm cheated a little bit here because there's kind of two images, but for anyone who's based or spent a lot of time in London, you might recognize this. This is the Sky Garden at the top of 20 Fenchurch Street. This was a building that was completed in about 2014. And the interesting thing for me about this is that the top image is essentially the image that was attached to the planning application. The image at the bottom is the result. Obviously quite a huge contrast, but I think the interesting story here is essentially this is a super tall office skyscraper that is only usually allowed within the kind of commercial core of London's financial district. This building was allowed to be placed outside of that core, closer to the river, specifically because it had this supposed provision of a public park, an enclosed public park on top of the building. And this raises lots of questions for me, both about this idea of access to green space, which is something that I think is really important. This was sold as a public park, whereas in actuality, when the building was completed, you have to book a ticket, you have to go through kind of airport-style security to get up there. And when you do get up there, what you find is not kind of this above image of, still obviously quite a fairly landscaped and kind of controlled space, but quite verdant. The circulation is quite natural. What you see is what is below, which is essentially a series of 2 restaurants with some kind of bedding either side. So I think it's really interesting from the perspective of the fact that the provision of green public space was enough to completely circumnavigate the planning system. The fact that it makes sense that nature is something that becomes this kind of almost theme park attraction in the context of the city, something you might book a ticket to. And also, I guess, kind of just the difference between aspiration and implementation of such projects. Of course, the top is an aspiration, it's a sketch, but kind of the lack of follow-through on that is, in this instance, quite dramatic. So I think maybe on that note, I'd kind of like to perhaps return to you, Nina, and talk about kind of, I know Moss, as we've just been discussing, was the amalgamation of 2 companies, so it's got a history, but I'd be interested to know kind of from your experience when you started in this field, where we're at kind of in relation to your image here. Is this the kind of thing that you're still kind of facing, or what people expect from the integration of nature into the workspace or hospitality spaces? And how do you go about kind of having that conversation as to why it needs to be slightly more of a developed, integrated, holistic system?
Yeah. We've started, me and Tessa, it's like one of the co-founders, we are with the 3 of us now. We started in 2013, really with the company Roof Life, it was called by then, and we were aiming to use the unused surface of the city, the roof, as a part where we could add green into the city, because we were thinking like, okay, is this the city where I want to live in the future? 80% of the world population will live in an urban environment in the future, and even from that time we spend 90% indoors, and our connection with nature totally disappears. At that point we started really thinking about like water drainage is a problem in the city, the air condition in the city is like a problem. The lack of going to a place which is green is something we have an urge to go to, so otherwise we have to go out of the city. So that's where we started. By then it was really difficult to get projects because people didn't saw the value of adding green to a building, especially when it was on the roof and it was not accessible. They said, yeah, okay, but why should we invest? What is in it for me? We said, yeah, but it's biodiversity. Your building lacks less energy through the roof. So that was all things we tried to point, but it wasn't really working. And then slowly we got in contact with architects, and somehow kind of a trend existed about like making buildings really green with a button on the render program or something, and it totally got green. And then they came to us, okay, yeah, but we made this render and we got the project, but what should we do now? We have a budget of 30,000 euros. And then we were looking at, yeah, okay, this is like maybe 300,000 euros. You need to make this building green. And from there on, we really start thinking about, okay, we need to or design it ourselves or consult parties who are willing to add green to the buildings in a way that's really also contributing something for them. Mm-hmm. So we start really doing building-related green in and on top of buildings. because of course 90% of our time, especially in the Netherlands when the winter is spent indoors, and we are losing entirely our connection with nature. And that's also why I think, yeah, the 3 reasons why people at the beginning, I really was interested in what you were saying, is that's what we are trying to bring back now. So the connection with nature, people learning how plants are growing. Plants are not in real nature. You will never see like one plant standing alone in a corner. It's always like an ecosystem of at least some grass or 3 other plants and an animal living around it. So, and we are, like from origin, we are also part of nature. So how can we bring back the connection with nature in all kind of senses that we feel happy and healthy in the city where we live in?
I think that educational aspect is a really interesting thing to press on. I know, Koert, I've watched some of your previous presentations, and there's a thing that you bring up a couple of times about the fact that children these days know more brand names than they do know the names of, you know, plants or animals.
That's where we are now, that children know more brands and logos than birds or tree species.
And I think this idea, you know, I guess also with your image of this kind of facsimile of nature as opposed to kind of the lived experience of nature, and what you were saying, Nina, it's kind of this idea of stewardship. It's actually being kind of living in relation to the plants and understanding their life cycles and things like that. Is that something that you think we need to almost, I don't want to make this sound too kind of overblown, but almost if we're going to reconnect with the natural environment, we need to have that kind of stewardship aspect brought back into our day-to-day life?
Yeah, I think to be happy and be and to have, I think it's also like existing now that younger, like the younger generation is having the urge of like, where's my product coming from? How is it grown? How does it work? Also like, how do you maintain something? That it's coming back because we became really far away from where it first was, and now people are looking for this reconnection. And I definitely think, yeah, that also education part and like understanding why it's really important to make this change altogether.
And Penny, was that a fundamental part of the way plants were integrated historically into domestic spaces? You know, the stewardship aspect, the, I suppose, interior gardening to an extent.
Yes, I mean, I think if we go back to the Victorian period, I hope we come back to the present in a minute, but there was definitely a sense of kind of mutual respect. I mean, I'm saying, you know, people respecting the plants and believing the plants respected them, I think, as well. And the sense of there being living and people and plants both being living was understood much more, I think.
I think a really interesting thing that I think you've talked about, Penny, in the past is kind of the symbolism of plants, and you've kind of touched on it in relation to gods, but I think I'm not quite sure what symbolic function plants pose now compared to, you know, in the historical periods that you'd be discussing in this book. I mean, do you have a view on that?
I think it's quite complicated, but I do think they are symbolic. I think that's essentially why we're putting them inside. I think the most obvious one is that they're a kind of shorthand for having environmentalist beliefs. I think they stand for a sort of, we're green, you know, they're an instant message, particularly in the commercial sphere. As soon as you put them into an office or a shop, particularly, it's a sort of, you know, a righteous statement in a way, subliminally or not.
Do you have a...
Well, I want to comment on the stewardship because, yes, that's important. And I think now many people want to restore the balance with nature or even save nature. And that's wonderful, but hardly ever do we ask the question, what is our image of nature and how might that be shifting in the 21st century? And I think this notion of stewardship, there's a tension there because it assumes like we are the masters. Yeah. It's also slightly paternalistic, like nature, we nailed it, we put you in a pot, we put the plant in the corner, and yes, we're going to take care of you. That's an assumption that I don't agree with. It doesn't work because if you look further back in history, nature was dangerous. It was wild, unpredictable, scary, life-threatening. And because we started developing technology and inventing all kinds of things, basically we freed ourselves from these wild forces of nature. And then I think the question is, if you search for true nature, where do you find it? Well, maybe not a plant in a pot. I would like to see something wilder, But then it also becomes weird and abstract.
But I think that is a very interesting question, and we call this talk Wild Inside because I think that is almost the ultimate goal or an aspiration. We don't just want to have nature inside, but almost is there the potential to create a wilderness that exists within kind of urban or even interior spaces in a much more fundamental way. And I know, one of the interesting things I think about your practice and the way you talk about your practice on your websites is that I feel like there's, an admittance that maybe clients are not quite where you would like them to be in terms of thinking about how to embrace nature in a fully fledged fundamental way. I mean, is that a conversation you have to have with them? Do they come to you with certain ideas of what they want and why they want it, and do you have to kind of almost educate them as to the best parameters along which to kind of invest in these types of systems, and how kind of, you describe the way you put plants into the interior as kind of oases and landscapes. You're already kind of using that terminology, which is almost taken from the wilderness and trying to bring it inside. Is that a journey you think we have to go on to kind of create much more kind of developed, holistic ideas of how we bring nature into the interior?
Yeah, so what we notice is we of course have still parties who still like going for the more old school, or like we call it maybe old-fashioned way of like placing planters and pots. It's also like when they're already in an already original building or existing building, it's not always possible to integrate the green as how we would prefer to advise them to do it. Mm-hmm. Sometimes they even have the idealistic vision, okay, we want that. But then, of course, there are a lot of things playing with, like irrigation, weight, the light condition within a building, the space it's taking into account. So sometimes we can't even advise them to do it how we would prefer to do it. Mm-hmm. But in many cases, we now slowly get like that. We get involved earlier in the trajectory of a design process, and as soon as we are able to step into the beginning of the process, we really can think together like, how can we make this bigger impact, create something which is not there for like a short time, but really can be like a part of the building and an experience, and indeed more the wilderness. Yeah, you will never be able to create the entire jungle with the animals and everything, but even creating or striving for something which looks more like nature. We had in the past a client, and they called me like, it's not going well, they're growing mushrooms in my garden, and that's not healthy. And we were like, oh, but that's great, because now nature's happy, at least in the building, and of course we will remove them, but this is a good sign, because the plants were growing and they were developing, and that's a good thing. So yeah, what we prefer is just to jump in as soon as possible and advise them that plants can really have this great environment to grow in, mm-hmm. and that we can do that together. We love to design it ourselves, but sometimes it is already be designed, and then we can better advise them that it's gonna work good at the end, that they don't have to, because it's still quite an investment to do. So they think about, okay, what percentage of my budget can I use for green? And then they have like seen images with trees in indoor environments, but a tree has time to grow. It's just like me getting older and having the knowledge to talk about green. It took me 33 years to get there. A tree with 7 meters, of course it's expensive, and you cannot buy it for 300 euros because it had needed the time to become this beautiful old tree. So if you tell someone like this tree is 7,000 euros, it's like, yeah, but then I can have only 1 tree in my building. Yes, that's true, but that is something people, if you really want that, you have to think about what can I do to make it, and what it gives back to me or to my employees or to the building, what is like in that regard also valuable. Mm. So
I think an interesting kind of inflection point here is kind of this idea that to really have nature in the interior space in a kind of a fundamental way, you have to give up a bit of the control. Nature is by its very nature kind of wild, chaotic, kind of indeterminate. Penny, I'm wondering whether, obviously pre-modern, or maybe that's not the right phrase, but Victorian interiors, much more chaotic, mm-hmm. Modernism, very much about control. Have we kind of arrived at a point which we are more able to reintroduce a bit of chaos into the interior space? And
I
did we
hope
go
so.
from chaos to control, and can we move
Yeah,
back to chaos?
It's true. If we kind of whiz through the history from the 19th century to the present, you get the sort of Victorian wildness, which is pretty wild. Then through modernism, control comes in, but nature's still there, but it's the cactus, because the cactus is a nice, tight, controlled sculptural object, and you can just place it on a shelf. So it's a sort of very controlling use of it. I think in sort of late modernism, particularly in the States, things like the Ford Foundation building, they do go back to quite large scale, quite chaotic spaces. And I think we're going there internally now as well. Yeah. Particularly in the way you're speaking, I think it's not that nice, neat little cactus anymore.
And in terms of the way architects over that period have thought about the integration of nature, is there kind of an evolutionary process? Because it feels like you were saying beforehand, maybe in the States, there's more of a history of having people, consultants come in and talk about these things, whereas maybe in Europe, it's much more of a fledgling kind of enterprise.
I think it's been going in the States a lot longer than it has in Europe because of the way the sort of large atria buildings developed through the 50s and 60s, and large shopping malls and very large spaces where they filled in with plantings. And new professions grew up. They called them interior-scapers, plant-scapers, and there was a much more sense that the architects, the interior designers, the horticulturalists, the plant-scapers had to all work together. And I think that's coming in a bit more here now, that sense of collaboration.
Of course, if you look at this image, this is all amateur.
Totally, this is the housewife.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
It's kind of, I guess there's a professionalization of this idea of how to create
and
interior.
that's got more and more as we've gone on.
Shall we look at kind of the future images? This must be, again, you, Nina.
Yeah. So this is Elho. It's a project of this is a company who designs the pots for plants, but their team is bring back nature. And be surrounded by nature, and we work together with the architect Space Encounters, and this is really how we would love to see green integrated in the built environment. It's not added; it's really integrated. It's part of it. Everything is designed around the green. It's it has a huge impact, but therefore I think also the people would feel that they are surrounded by nature. Of course, they still, they can say if you integrate green, your employees will be 20% more productive or happy or whatever. Of course, still, if the boss is screaming to them that they are assholes and they don't do their work good, you should not think that green would fix everything for your company, but at least this can help a lot to feel happier, healthier, and be surrounded and have the connection with nature again.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting thing about kind of the movement towards biophilic design. It's kind of, the instrumentalization of it, as a science in relation to things like productivity. Do people put too much emphasis on it and think it's going to have more impact or be more responsible for kind of those metrics than it actually is? And is that something that you have to kind of negotiate with them?
No, I think it really depends. I think people should make wise decisions where to put green and what the impact of it and how people are surrounded by it. This is of course a company who is totally about green, so their whole building is filled with it. But we even started with the design for this building with 11 indoor gardens like this, and then it has been brought down to 6 at the end due to budget, but also feasibility and that kind of stuff. I sometimes think it's better to create a few oases or places where people can go to escape from their daily routines, and maybe also to get them away from their desk. Of course, it's nice to see a plant from the side of your corner standing in the room you're working in. But if you can really go away and visit the place or get this new feeling and go back to your desk afterwards, it can also be interesting. So it doesn't have to be always that much or this giant impact, but at least it's good to have a few places where you have the opportunity to.
May I ask something? How do you feel about who should take care of these plants? The people working in the office or some other entity that arranges it?
It would be great if the working office could do it. The lessons have learned in the past that it's really not
difficult,
possible.
Right?
So we are also not installing ourselves anymore. We did it in the past, but now we felt it's better to have parties who are totally focused on this. It is their main business. So they're doing the installing and maintenance, and they get contracts with companies for between the 5 and 20 years to keep the green in the status as it's installed. So as long as they have this 20 years contract, it's also for them to keep it alive, because of course replacing one tree is not what you want, not for the nature, but also not for the cost. So,
would you kind of aspire going forward to, going back to this idea of oases and landscapes, in the future, perhaps these things to be more interconnected, for it to feel like one kind of continuous ecosystem or kind of biome rather than these individual kind of islands of greenery, but more kind of an interior landscape that has kind of throughput. And also, as someone who, you work at the urban scale, you work at the exterior scale, and you work at the interior scale, do you see any potential for those things coexisting in an almost interconnected way? Because I feel at the moment, the way we look at kind of greening the city, and if you look at architects like Stefano Boeri, there's a lot of greening of the city, but you never know how that actually impacts the interior of those buildings. And as you say, we spend 90% of our time inside. So I'm just really interested in this idea that perhaps there can be this interconnection between those exterior green spaces and the interior.
Yeah, I think it's best to have both.
Yeah.
Always, especially because we are dealing with a lot of problems in the outdoor environment, of course. I mean, the indoor is more about the well-being of the employees or the people working. We spend a lot of time, but I think coping with the current status of the city environment, it definitely asks for making buildings green, because there's like hardly any space to go to, but also for biodiversity within the city environment. The water retention. I think like if we're not doing anything, this gray surface of bricks and asphalt and stuff, we need drainage before it hits like the drainage system. So it definitely needs more green. And I think like going from your home to the work, seeing green and entering a building which is green. So like the image you've shown where it's like part of the building. So you hardly maybe not even see it's a building, but it's green and you enter it by accident. And then there is maybe even more green, or you can go outside for a second. But even like if you see the environment where this building is placed, even if I do a walk during my lunch outdoor, it will not bring me that much. I'm surrounded by highways and a few not the most beautiful buildings, but there's no green to walk to. So if the building was surrounded by a park already, it would also help a lot.
And so, Penny, this is your image, which must be an Apple store.
It's an Apple store, yes. Shall I say why I chose to put it up? Well, I think because for me, it contains the tension, the kind of tension you find when you find these trees in commercial spaces. And that tension is between, on the one hand, it's great because, they're softening those hard surfaces, they're creating an atmosphere that's a relaxing atmosphere, etc. And so, on the one hand, it's great. On the other hand, being a bit of a cynic, one would say that people who are commissioning these sorts of things know very well, because the science is actually there, that if people are more relaxed, they'll consume more. It's a bit the productivity argument you were giving earlier. And through the 70s and 80s, huge amount of money was invested in scientific research, environmental psychologists and medics as well, doing work on the way your blood pressure goes down and also your heartbeat goes down in the presence of plants and trees. And, instrumentalization is the word you use, that's the right one. So I think there's a kind of tension, and I'm not sure how we resolve that, really.
And then, Koert, this is your image. I recognize this from one of your talks.
Yeah, indeed. So, we discussed... I'm the person who wrote an essay over a decade ago called "Real Nature is Not Green." And often we put something green and then we think, yes, it's nature. And it's sort of also it's this agreement. It's just like the nude beach. That if you go to the nude beach, then you have this spot where you enter, and there you wear your clothes. But then you are on the nude beach, and there you undress and you are naked, and it's completely normal. But it's an agreement, and that's also how we treat nature, as an agreement. Like it's the green stuff in the room, that's nature. And there's a huge tension there that I think we all feel, and I don't have the solution. I'm not an interior decorator. I think there are people in the room here who might have the solution. But if you search for this nature as an autonomous, maybe sometimes wild, slightly uncanny quality, then where do you find it? Well, not in the plant in the office, but maybe in this image. And this is not some star nebula somewhere far, far away, but it's much closer than you think. It's the map of the internet. So every device connected to the internet is plotted as a dot, and then all the lines behind it, between it, plotted as lines. And then you get this structure, which I think is a beautiful structure, and it also feels natural to me. But we never really designed it. It kind of grew around us. And this also teaches us that just like the fish who don't know it's wet, we are dwelling in this technological environment that grows, that changes, and that perhaps also has a certain natural dynamic. Well, at Next Nature Network, we try to study this dynamic and try to cope with it and find a path towards the future where we can have a better balance between biology and technology. And the office is at the forefront, or the interior space. So, no, I don't have the answers, but it's super interesting to explore how can we design that in a different way. Because yes, people have needs, and we are basic animals that evolved on the savannah, and we have some kind of physical needs for our well-being. And the office or the interior that we have today doesn't facilitate that in a proper way just yet. So how can we do that? By copying something we know. Well, the plastic flower is the ultimate example, but also the ultimate failure. Putting a plastic flower in your house and then you think, yes, it's nature. Well, no. Or should we find some other relationship with our technological environment? So, for instance, if we can go back to your image, well, one more. This one, I think it's super interesting. I love the work. It's better than what we have in the office. We also have plants in our Next Nature office, and it's always an issue like, do we care about the plants? I love plants. I care a lot about the plants. I see them as slow-moving animals, and we have a relationship with them. We need to water them. We need to look after them. And here they become more of a zone that takes this space. However, if you ask the question, is there more wildness in the world of the plants or in the world of the computers? I'm really not sure. There are so many viruses and spyware in these computers. We don't control that world, and it's easier even to control that world of those plants. So how to move forward? Again, I don't have the answers, guys, but let's try to find a balance here.
An answer.
Well, I was just going to pick up what you were saying from a slightly different angle, because one of the explanations given, right or wrong, as to why we're doing this, bringing these things in, is to offset our kind of obsession with technology. It's a sort of counteraction.
Yeah,
So,
yeah.
you know,
It's like,
yeah,
but it's like black and white or day and night. It's like
part of
we
the
see
same.
nature and technology as opposites.
Sure.
And my argument is like, no,
It's continuous.
because it's continuous, and with our technology, we free ourselves from some wild forces of nature. This begins with a roof above your head so that you don't get wet, or clothing that you don't get cold. But now our technology is so omnipresent, often wild and uncontrollable, that it becomes the next nature. And yeah, maybe it's even wilder and uncontrollable than some of the nature that from the past. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's interesting, talking about this idea of control. I mean, I guess you could argue that our failed attempts to control nature and our failed attempts to control technology are the source of most of the issues we have with both of those two worlds. And we were talking about stewardship.
Yeah.
Do you think there might be a case for kind of stepping back and letting those two systems look after each other in a way that we perhaps fundamentally can?
Yeah, I completely agree. Because this notion of we need to control everything, it's not a good quality of life, and it's never going to work. But it's this idea of of modernism and enlightenment. Knowledge is power. So if you know more, then you can control everything, and then you will end up in this perfect world. Well, now we know it's not going to happen, because yes, we can manipulate a lot, but you can never really control it, because while you are manipulating your environment, surprises happen. And you better have a lean back attitude. So, for instance, a method that you could say, let's guide the growth. That relates also more to the stewardship, although I like to step away from the paternalistic element in it. But let's try to guide the growth of some autonomous entities in our environment. Well, yes, maybe then we can get a better world.
So my image is from what is called the Low Line, which was an enterprise Lower East Side of New York. I found out, so this was supposed to be completed. This is just a case study kind of showing the technology. It was supposed to be completed in 2021, but it was actually announced yesterday that they don't have the funding, so unfortunately it's now not going to happen. But the thing I really like about this is the Low Line essentially is a trolley park underground in the Lower East Side of New York, a kind of dead space about the size of a football pitch that wasn't being used for anything. And the idea behind the Low Line, obviously riffing on the success of the High Line, was that they would use technology, these kind of solar funnels, to bring light from the surface down into this underground space and actually create kind of a semi-natural environment. And I'm not really commenting on what I think is good about this is not necessarily the kind of context of it, because I'm sure it would still in some way be a gimmick. And I don't know what the rights of access would be, so would it really be a civic space? But I do really like this core idea of kind of using technology to reclaim spaces within the city that have somehow been lost. And I think solar funnels are not kind of a complicated kind of AI-driven machine learning uncontrollable thing, but you can imagine those kind of systems in relation to things like this, kind of identifying the right places to maybe kind of rewild in the city to kind of reclaim that space. And it's, in complete antithesis to building a skyscraper and putting a park on top of it as kind of reclaiming underground space that can be kind of maybe returns to nature in a slightly less controlled way.
Can I add something to what he was saying about, because like looking for the answer or something, but I think what's great to see at this moment is like that there's really starting to become a movement of how nature can become more part of the architecture again, and not only like in placing indoor gardens or whatever, but you also have architects now who are looking into building the building with the nature itself. So I recently saw like an episode on Netflix where an architect is growing buildings, so it takes a long time, but it's building the structures with the nature and it's guiding it. And of course that's like far in the future, but I think what most interesting is, and also with the technology, a few years ago, like people were like reacting on indoor farming or something, like I don't want to eat anything which is grown underneath pink light, but we're growing to a point where technology and nature, and we also see like what the strengths from nature we can take to make building in a natural way is again possible. And yeah, if you see where we're coming from, or where we first were and then where we got and now where we're going through, also with the buildings of what you said, like from Stefano Bueri, he was of course the first one in Milano with this building, but it wasn't right in once. They had a lot of problems in getting all this green good, and he had a lot of comments at the beginning, like this building is not working. But if you see it now, it's working. It took a time, and now other architects are learning from it, to see like how nature can take over a building and biodiversity can take over the building. And I think that's the direction. And of course, it's not like tomorrow it's like that, but already the shift of architects and designers thinking how nature is again the main element of where you should start from with designing, is I think a really cool development.
Koert, you have this kind of concept of kind of the born and the made, if I've got that correct?
That's correct, yes.
This kind of dichotomy.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering whether, what we're really talking about here is kind of the removal of that and trying to find some sort of compromise between nature and technology, the born and the made, that we haven't yet, in some way been able to envision.
Yes, yeah, and So typically we think of the born and the made, and then nature is the born, or everything that emerged, plants, animals, the climate, the universe. These are the natural things, they're born, and culture, that's what we make, and then that's always black and white. But I think the example you just gave, I find that very inspiring, that some of the things we make also, well, they grow on their own, and they have maybe, they can get a natural dynamics of growth. So the example you give of that the building might grow, and indeed we cannot do that today, but I would like to live in the future where you grow your own house, and then if you have a new child and you extend your family, the house grows an additional room, and that kind of organic dream, which is today an ultimate fiction, but that would be the merging of made and born things. And I think there's a lot of energy there. There's also a challenge there, because when you start talking about it, people might say, but you cannot really do that, right? And then, yes, indeed, you cannot do it today, but at least you know where you want to go. And if you know where you want to go, then you can make the next step. So this complete balance between biology and technology, and live happily ever after. Maybe it's a fiction, but at least it's an aspiration as well, that you can make steps today. And indeed, architects and also designers are already doing this in different ways. So working with living material to construct environments and to basically grow things. Let's go there. I'm ready.
Does anyone have any questions? No questions yet. Penny, I have a question for you.
Okay.
You wrote this book based on the realization that this was somehow kind of a blind spot in the history of interior design, even though fundamentally, plants, natural materials, what we now call biophilic design, has been part of that conversation since time immemorial. Why do you think that is such a blind spot?
It's interesting. I'm a historian of the interior, and plants have just been left out. They're just not there. And I think it's because what you said right at the beginning, they're mundane. They're seen as trivial, mundane. And there's that sense that, if you see a photograph of an interior, historically this is, that they're just put there for the photographer, and it's a sort of, they put in the last minute. Whereas in fact, it's a much more, as you explained, much more integrated, and has to be there up front, in fact, before you design your building. I think it's just a short-sightedness of historians to realize that, really. Mm-hmm. And historians have all come out of modernism, so they've all got that sense of the sort of the great power of architecture, and the triviality of the rest. I think it's part of that culture. And it's feminized as well, of course. There's a gender story in there. Let's not forget that.
And Nina, we were talking before about how you essentially work with architects on these projects, and you touched on this a little bit, but I'd be interested to get your take on what you feel the architecture profession has to think about to adapt to be able to integrate these systems more effectively, in terms of maybe even when they bring you in, but should they predominantly be creating an environment for plants, which is therefore the best environment for us to live and work in, to simplify it? Is that how we need to start thinking about things? I don't necessarily mean we all live in biodomes, but does that suggest a kind of completely different type of architecture to what we have today?
I think like in countries where nature can grow in a way that it's natural and it's like a lot possibilities, like for in Singapore, it's like you will be surrounded by green because it's growing so naturally. The city is green, a lot of buildings are green. It's an easy way to integrate it. In the Netherlands, we of course have already some more difficulties with like exterior projects, and but we are working now on a project in Iceland, for example, where there is a lot less like daylight during the days, and it's really hard to grow nature outdoor and bring people in the connection with green. So there is where they have thought of like building a biodome and integrate green and to attract people to go there. So like you said, like people are willing to maybe in the future pay to be surrounded by green, especially when they only have like 6 hours of daylight in the winter a day. So I think in what way, as soon as we are like still going on with growing this city environment, we should think in a way how to integrate it. And if it's like, if we can bring people on one side for their well-being and health in an indoor environment in connection with nature, then that would be great. But of course, I still would love to see that green is a much bigger part of a city environment. So not building packed all these cityscrapers next to each other, but think about how green can be part of the city again, instead of, and then maybe traveling a bit longer. But if you can travel through nature to the next building, it would be a lot more fun than only building block, building block, building. So we are forced now to make it part of a building. In this, like in Amsterdam, there's no space left to make a big park. So then we should add it to the building.
Yeah.
But if you're really thinking about the new ideal city, I would not recommend to make all these buildings per se green, but think about how we can live in between nature.
I think the kind of question of access is a really interesting one that I'd like to go back to. I mean, biophilic design is, I would presume, expensive or more expensive. Is it something that we are at risk of just kind of only a certain sector of society has access to? You know, it's just people have their green oases if they can afford it. I'm thinking of the fact that, you know, Jeff Bezos committed something 10 billion of his fortune to fighting climate change the other day. The office they've just opened in Seattle is essentially 3 kind of biodomes, but then you think about the fact that Amazon is responsible through its data centers, through the logistics of its, you know, e-commerce business, a heavy contributor to climate change, environmental degradation. There is a kind of dystopian side to this where nature only exists in any kind of form in a kind of energizing, improving way in these kind of enclaves that can only be afforded by, you know, a certain sector of society. It's not really a question, but it's something that I think is worth
I just mentioned the Victorian period. That wasn't the case because the smallest geranium in a pot was a very working class thing, so it was much more spread through. Yeah.
Any questions? We've got a question over here. Are there roving microphones?
Yeah, my question is like, how do you proof point then the value to clients? How do you prove the value of bringing plants into the space to clients? What's the most convincing argument for them? Or
for us, it's nowadays like if we also look to our clients, why they are looking for green, it's like indeed the storytelling to the employees about the well-being. So what you said is also like a lot of companies are fighting for the best employees. So you see that all the bookings, the Googles, the Microsofts, the Ubers, they are like doing all this stuff to make their office more attractive to attracting people to work for them. So that's one reason why they would integrate green. But at the end, of course, I think like having your employees healthy and happy and motivated to work at your place. And if that's due to like adding green into their work, it's the value that they are happy and like to come to the office, and that you don't have like many people who want to stay at home or say they are not coming. And so that's for us more the main reason why we do it. But of course you see the trend that it's just like also showing like, look at me, I have the coolest office.
Any other questions? Just one over here.
Yeah, thank you for the discussion. I really liked it. One question is that you've been talking, all of you, a bit like becoming the next ecosystems within a building. But of course, we need, in an ecosystem, you also need animals. And I thought, well, maybe humans are the animals within it, but also the insects and everything living within it. And how do you feel how we should perceive those parts of biophilic design ecosystems in the future? Like, how do we... What's their stance on having bees in the office and that kind of stuff?
That's indeed like a difficult, because the first thing they are saying is like, we don't want animals surrounded. It's like small flies and that kind of stuff. But it's not possible to not have them at all, especially when you have this bigger gardens. you will deal on a certain day with some attraction of flies. Of course, we think with like ecosystems directly on birds and butterflies surrounded in your office, but it's still also about more the smaller kind of schimmels.
Fungus.
Yeah, they are also living in the substrate, and that's like on a smaller scale. We won't see it, but it's still happening. But yeah, it would be lovely if people would say like, I would love to integrate also birds in my office environment, but then you get to deal with that they're pooping on desk or something. So yeah, of course it's cool, cool to look forward in maybe that parties are open for this. But yeah, it's still finding a balance in between what is possible. And even with hospitals, for example, we love to grow our plants in a substrate kind of environment and not in the hydrocoils. But in hospitals, for example, they have a lot of regulations, so they're not even allowed to have a substrate and this ecosystem in it because it's like a risk for their patients and stuff. So that's also something we have to keep in mind.
And I think that kind of goes back to what we were talking about in terms of control. You know, you can't really have this optionality on bringing this stuff in because nature will kind of do its own thing anyway. These things are all required for those plants to exist in some sort of way in the space. So I think it's kind of, yeah, really a question of how much control people are willing to give up. And maybe if technology can step in to kind of manage that relationship, that might be one way of circumnavigating that problem. But yeah, I don't think you can have an optional relationship with nature and just say we want this bit. Otherwise you end up with what you said at the start, where you just have these facsimiles which aren't really, you know, developing any relationship to nature at all.
No, indeed. And yeah, we say we want nature in our office, but you know, only the good part.
Yeah.
And in a way there's also there's an inner conflict there in our desires. So we should also look at our desires. And what are we willing to accept? And maybe an option is also, if you talk about the office, to organize more that you can work outside. You know, now in your, again, I really love the word beautiful setup. You still sit on the desk behind the computer the entire day. That's the model. And we also have to look at the bigger picture, not only at how do we place nice plants in our office space, but also what is the notion of work? How are we being domesticated ourselves by our work? And how can we redesign that? And then on a deeper level also have a better relationship with the environment, with the natural world. And sometimes the answer is just pick up your laptop and go work outside in the park. People are doing that already. So and then it becomes more dynamic, because in the park it's allowed that a bird is there and shits maybe well, not on your clothes, but let's say. So we have all these frames in our minds, and I think it's important to be willing to address that as well before we can design the better relationship with nature in our interior.
Okay, on that note, I think we're going to have to wrap up. So thanks all very much for coming and contributing so thoroughly to this conversation, and thanks guys for all your questions.
Thank you.